3 words can turn a piece of paper into a key that opens treasure. I do not speak of luck. I speak of law. And if you dare to say them before you hold your ticket, you will see what the world calls chance bow to divine certainty. In this teaching, I will unfold the difference between hope and faith, chance and law. You will learn why idle speech attracts loss, and why the right words spoken at the right moment commands supply. I will give you case stories of those who spoke their decree and watched unexpected money arrive. You will learn how to guard your mind from fear, how to use grace to protect your winnings, and how to place gratitude on every sum so it multiplies. And before we close, you will know exactly what 3 words to speak before you touch a lottery ticket. Words that change your odds. Words that align you with the unfailing supply of God. Here's something most people completely miss. They think money comes by luck. They think life changes by chance. They think if they can just guess the right number, if they can just scratch the right card, if they can just happen upon the right day, everything will suddenly turn. And so they live in the worship of chance, bowing down before a false god that never delivers. For luck is blind, luck is deaf, luck is dumb. Luck has no law behind it. And whatever has no law behind it cannot stand. You may win once by luck, but you will lose 1,000 times more, for luck cannot be trusted. Luck is a liar, and those who depend on it wake up poor, discouraged and bound by fear. Do you see the pattern? A man buys his ticket and says, "I hope I win." He is already preparing for defeat. His words are sowing failure before the numbers are even drawn. His subconscious hears him say, "I hope," and it replies, "Then you do not expect. If you do not expect, then you do not believe. If you do not believe, then you do not receive." Hope without faith is only a wish, and wishes are weak things. They float in the air, but they do not root in the soil. And what happens when a man keeps repeating these hopeless words? He reaps exactly what he has planted. He spends his money on tickets, but he plants his words in defeat. He goes to bed saying, "I never win. I never get lucky," and the subconscious makes it law, delivering the harvest of his own lips. I have known men who prepared speeches for their failure, rehearsing what they would say when they lost. I have known women who bought tickets but said in the same breath, "It never works for me." And they were right. Not because fate cursed them, but because their own word condemned them. That's why I say relying on luck is like planting seed on the stone. It looks like something may sprout, but the ground is barren and the seed dies. No matter how many times you scatter, the soil gives you nothing. And yet the crowd runs after luck, buying, clutching, begging, hoping, while law stands beside them, ignored, waiting to serve them. Law is exact, law is sure, law is unfailing, but luck is only a mirage. Now, let me ask you, have you ever noticed that the ones who cry the loudest about never winning are the ones who always speak of loss? They tell you before they scratch, "I know I won't win." They tell you before the numbers are drawn, "It's just for fun, but I never get picked." They are making a law with their own tongue, and law does not argue. Law obeys, and so it is done unto them exactly as they believe, exactly as they speak. This is why most people remain in the same cycle. They are sowing the wrong seed and expecting a right harvest. They are planting words of lack and waiting for fruit of abundance. They are filling their subconscious with defeat and expecting victory. And when it doesn't come, they say it's just bad luck. No, my friend, it is not luck. It is law. So I tell you, stop trusting luck. Stop clutching tickets with fear. Stop speaking hope as if it were faith. Luck will fail you every time, but the word never fails. The difference between those who lose and those who win is not the paper in their hand, but the word on their lips. And if you learn this law, you can step out of the crowd of losers and into the few who walk in demonstration. What I am about to share may sound too simple for the reasoning mind, and yet it is the most powerful truth you will ever know. Luck fails, but law never fails. The world worships chance because it does not know law. But the universe is not a lottery of chaos. It is a kingdom of order. Every word, every thought, every decree sets a cause in motion, and that cause unfailingly produces its effect. This is why Jesus declared, "By thy words, thou shalt be justified, and by thy words, thou shalt be condemned." He did not say by thy lottery numbers, by thy guesses, by thy chances. He said, by thy words, for the word is the seed, and the seed must grow. I have watched students step out of despair and into abundance by grasping this simple key. They stopped crying for luck and began speaking law. One woman came to me with fear in her eyes, clutching the little she had, certain she was doomed to lose. I told her, your fear is faith inverted. Reverse it now. Speak supply instead of lack. Declare abundance instead of ruin. Say, God is my supply and large sums of money come to me, quickly under grace in perfect ways. Say it until you feel it. She obeyed, and within days unexpected money came into her hands. Not by luck, but by law. You see, law is impartial. Law does not say, I like this one better than that one. I will bless him and curse her. Law is exact. If you speak lack, you reap lack. If you speak abundance, you reap abundance. It is not personal. It is principle. The farmer does not put corn in the ground and reap wheat. He reaps the same seed he sows. So it is with you. If you sow words of defeat, you will reap defeat. If you sow words of victory, you will reap victory. The harvest may seem to delay, but it cannot be denied. For the law never fails. I once had a student who said to me, Florence, I have affirmed prosperity, but I still see no change. I asked her, have you mixed your words with doubt? Have you sown abundance by day, but dug it up with worry at night? Have you spoken faith in the morning and fear in the afternoon? She lowered her eyes, for she knew it was true. The law is exact. It does not multiply double-mindedness. It multiplies what you plant consistently. When she corrected her speech, when she guarded her tongue, when she refused to cancel her affirmations with contradictions, her affairs shifted, and she proved that the word works when you work the word. Now imagine the contrast. One man says, I hope this ticket wins, and he loses. Another man says, God is my unfailing supply and money flows to me from every direction under grace in perfect ways, and his purse fills. His needs are met, his channels open. The ticket may look the same, but the law behind it is different. One is supported by fear, the other by faith. One is a cry to chance, the other a decree to law, and law always answers. So hear me clearly. When you walk in law, you never walk in vain. When you speak the word of faith, the invisible must rearrange itself to match it. When you declare abundance, the channels of abundance must open. When you align your speech with truth, your life will outpicture truth. It is as certain as the rising of the sun, as sure as the tide of the sea. Luck stumbles and falls, but law stands forever. And that is why I tell you, never again say I hope. Say instead I know. Never again say I wish. Say instead I declare. Never again say maybe. Say instead, it is done. For heaven and earth may pass away, but the law of the word will not pass away. The word you speak in faith today is the world you will walk in tomorrow. And once you understand this, you will never again bow to luck. You will speak with authority. You will live in demonstration, and you will know by experience that the law never fails. Here is something the world overlooks, something so simple that the carnal mind laughs at it and calls it folly. And yet it is the one truth upon which every destiny rests. Every word is a seed. The ground does not argue with the farmer. It does not say this seed I will grow, and that seed I will reject. It does not reason. It does not laugh. It does not doubt. It simply receives, and it brings forth after its kind. The earth will as faithfully produce weeds as it will wheat, if that is what you sow. So it is with your subconscious mind. It is soil, rich, deep, unfailing, and it is waiting only for the seed you drop into it with your words. Every idle sentence, Every careless joke, every despairing sigh, every bold declaration, each one is a seed, and the soil does not forget. I knew a woman who had everything her heart could desire: a fine home, comfort, security. And yet she grew weary of her responsibilities, and in her foolishness she often cried, "I am sick and tired of all this. I wish I lived in a trunk." She said it half in jest, but the subconscious has no sense of humor. It does not know the difference between laughter and seriousness. It only hears the word and sets about to grow the seed. Years later, stripped of her possessions, cast out of her home, she found herself indeed living in a trunk, the exact harvest of her idle seed. Think of it. She had spoken herself into the very poverty she feared, not by some evil fate, not by the cruelty of others, but by her own tongue. Do you see the law? You are never a victim of circumstances. You are a sower of seed. If you do not like your harvest, do not curse the ground. Do not cry against the heavens, but change your seed. For just as surely as weeds once sprang from your careless words, so can wheat and roses and vineyards spring from your faithful words. Jesus Christ declared, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap, not some of what he sows, not a portion of what he sows, but all." If you continually say, "I never win. I never prosper. Nothing ever works out for me," you are sowing weeds, and the law will bring you a harvest of weeds. But if you say with conviction, "God is my unfailing supply, and great avalanches of abundance now pour into my life under grace," then you have planted good seed, and the ground must return good. Now, you may say, "Florence, I did not mean it. I was only joking. I was only speaking carelessly." But hear me. The subconscious does not know whether you mean it or not. It records every word as a phonograph records every sound. The cough, the stumble, the whisper, as well as the song. It plays back what is impressed upon it. And you must live among your records until you smash them with new decrees. That is why I tell you to watch your words, as you would watch your treasure. For they are treasure. They are the gold you cast into the invisible, that returns to you in visible form. So when you take that ticket in your hand, or when you speak about your affairs, do not let the tongue drop weeds into the soil of your mind. Do not say, "I never win. I always lose. Money never comes my way." For the law listens, the soil receives, and the harvest will come. Say instead, "I am an irresistible magnet, for all that belongs to me by divine right. I now draw an endless good under grace in perfect ways." Plant wheat instead of weeds, roses instead of thorns, gold instead of dust. For every word is a seed, and your harvest is nothing but the outpicturing of what you have sown. When I tell you that your word is your wand, I do not speak in poetry or in symbol only. I speak in the plainest law of spirit, as exact as mathematics, as certain as the rising of the morning sun. A wand is an instrument that carries the will of the one who wields it. It directs invisible forces. It calls into form what the eye of imagination has first beheld. And so it is with your word. Man does not often understand the treasure he carries upon his tongue. He jokes idly. He laments foolishly. He repeats phrases of lack and fear, and wonders why his world mirrors back to him lack and fear multiplied. Yet if he would only lift the rod of his word in faith, if he would dare to speak what the world calls impossible, the desert of his life would bloom, the barren purse would overflow, and the so-called odds of chance would bow down before him as servants. I once knew a woman who came to me with only $2 in her purse. To her eyes, $2 was poverty, a reminder of all she lacked. But I would not see lack for her, for lack is a lie, and I would not let the lie stand. I told her, "We bless these two, and we know that you hold the magic purse of the Spirit. It can never be depleted. As money goes out, immediately money comes in under grace in perfect ways. I see it crammed, jammed, bulging with yellow bills, green bills, checks of every color, silver, and gold pouring into your hand." She caught the vision. She felt her little purse heavy with money. as if invisible weight had already been dropped into it. Her faith was so alive that she gave me one of those dollars as a love offering, and I dared not refuse, for to refuse would have been to behold lack instead of plenty. And what followed? Shortly afterward, she was gifted 6,000. 2 had become 6,000, and the world called it luck. But she and I knew it was law. Do you see the power here? It was not the arithmetic of the bank. It was the arithmetic of spirit. The words crammed, jammed, bulging, painted a picture on her subconscious. And the subconscious, that faithful servant, had no choice but to bring the picture into visibility. Your subconscious does not respond to cold, lifeless statements. It responds to vivid images, to words charged with life and color. To say I have money may be true, but it is not electric. To say my purse is crammed, jammed, bulging with bills and checks, overflowing with abundance, is to set fire to the imagination. To strike the picture on the canvas of the inner mind, so that it cannot help but reproduce it outwardly. Now many will say, but Miss Shinn, am I not deceiving myself if I speak of a purse overflowing when I see only emptiness? And I answer, you are deceived already if you believe in emptiness. For emptiness is only an appearance, a shadow that flees before the light of truth. When you wave your wand, you are not lying. You are declaring the higher truth that dissolves the lie. Just as a fog can cover the ocean, yet cannot hide the ocean's depth, so appearances of lack can veil your abundance, but cannot cancel it. Speak the truth of supply, and the fog of lack will lift. I tell you again, the word is your wand. With it, you command fortune, you silence fear, you heal the body, you open doors that no man can shut. Without it, you wander as one unarmed, buffeted by appearances, waiting on what the world calls luck. Which shall it be for you? Will you drift with chance? Or will you take the wand in hand and decree your good? Remember this, the wand never fails when wielded with fearless faith. And the words you speak tonight may be the very words that crowd your purse tomorrow. Before you can speak the decree that commands fortune, before you can utter the 3 words that bend so-called chance into obedience, you must first prepare the ground of your consciousness, for it is no use scattering golden seed upon soil that has been left untended, full of weeds, rocks, and thorns. For the weeds will choke the harvest, the rocks will stop the roots, and the thorns will pierce the tender shoots before they can rise. And yet this is what most people attempt. They rush to speak affirmations, while their minds are still tangled with fear, still echoing with words of failure, still cluttered with the images of defeat, and then they cry out, the law does not work for me. But the law is exact. It works with what you give it. If you give it fear, it grows fear. If you give it worry, it grows worry. If you give it contradiction, it grows confusion. Only when you give it pure fearless seed can it give you back a harvest of plenty. So the first work is clearing. The first word is release. The first step is casting out fear. I have told my students again and again, fear is inverted faith. It is belief turned upside down. It is the same creative force. But instead of expecting good, it expects evil. Instead of calling in supply, it calls in lack. Instead of opening doors, it slams them shut. And when you take a lottery ticket in your hand and say, I hope I win, though I probably won't, you have already planted the seed of loss. You are already rehearsing defeat. You are already inviting the harvest of weeds. This is why I say to you, do not let fear go unchallenged. Do not carry it into the sacred hour of decree. Meet it at the gate and send it away. How do you send it away? By giving it to the Christ within. You cannot carry fear out by force. You must lay it down. Speak aloud with calm certainty. I cast this burden upon the Christ within and I go free. Say it until you feel the burden roll off your shoulders. Say it until your chest lightens and your breath deepens. Say it until the shadows in your mind scatter and peace enters. This one sentence is the broom that sweeps the floor of consciousness, the light that banishes darkness, the hand that sets down the load. And once you have spoken it, refuse to pick the burden up again. Do not rehearse the fear. Do not repeat the doubt. Do not argue for your own defeat. Cast it once and go free. When the mind is cleared, it must also be guarded. For many people sweep out the room, only to invite the same intruders back in. They cast out fear with one hand, and beckon it back with the other. They say, I cast this burden upon the Christ within. And then an hour later they sigh, but what if I still lose? This is double-mindedness, and the law cannot multiply double-mindedness. You must stand firm. You must close the door against fear, just as a guard closes the gates of a fortress. Let no thought enter that does not align with your decree. Say to every shadow, you have no place here. This ground is holy. This soil is reserved for the seed of truth. And the more you practice this, the more natural it will become until your subconscious itself stands guard and refuses to admit the enemy. Understand this well. The work of preparation is not wasted time. It is the most necessary step of all. For the decree, no matter how powerful, cannot take root in a mind still choked with weeds. But a decree, even a simple one, dropped into soil that is clear, fertile, and guarded, will grow swiftly, surely, abundantly. I have seen students who struggled for years suddenly receive demonstration after demonstration once they learned to prepare. They stopped speaking fear. They stopped rehearsing loss. They stopped clutching their burdens. And they cast them upon the Christ within. And then when they finally spoke their decrees, the decrees blossomed almost overnight. So prepare your mind, cast out fear, sweep away worry, guard against doubt, stand firm in faith, say it aloud even now. I cast this burden upon the Christ within and I go free. Feel the freedom, feel the lightness. Feel the ground of your soul made ready. For soon into this cleared soil, we shall plant the 3 words that change everything. You have cleared the ground. You have cast away the burden. You have swept the room of your mind, until it stands ready like a temple, prepared for the presence of God. Now the moment has come to place upon your lips the very decree that will change the atmosphere around you, that will alter the vibration of your affairs, that will turn the lie of chance into the certainty of law. And I tell you again, do not speak this as one testing to see if it works. Do not speak it as one pleading for mercy. Do not speak it as one whispering in hope. Speak it as one commanding, as one possessing, as one whose voice carries the authority of heaven itself. For the subconscious responds to authority, not to begging, not to wishing, not to fear. It hears certainty and it obeys. It hears command and it executes. It hears law and it fulfills. And here are the words, I win. Now 3 simple words, yet they carry within them the whole force of truth. Why? Because they are spoken in the present tense. The subconscious does not recognize tomorrow. It does not respond to someday. It does not act upon perhaps. It only knows the eternal now. When you say I will win, you push it away into the future, and the future never arrives. But when you say, I win now, you bring it into the only moment that ever exists, the present, and the subconscious rushes to make it so. This is the secret hidden in plain sight. You must declare your good as already done, not as a distant hope. Notice, too, that the words are short, sharp, unmistakable. There is no vagueness, no clutter, no condition. They are like the blow of a hammer on the anvil. I win now. Not I might, not I hope, not I wish. I win now. And every time you speak it, you are engraving a groove into the subconscious, a groove that the law must follow until it prints victory into your affairs. I remember a student who practiced this decree. She had long spoken timidly, I hope to do better. Perhaps things will change. Maybe next time. And the harvest was always disappointment. But when she learned to say, I win now, with fire and conviction, the atmosphere around her shifted. She walked differently. She spoke differently. She bought her ticket differently. And soon what she once called impossible appeared, not by chance, but by law. because she had dared to claim the now, instead of postponing her good into the mist of tomorrow. Now, let me warn you. When you first begin to say these words, appearances may rise up in protest. The ticket may look the same. The bank account may look the same. The purse may feel the same. But do not bow to appearances. For appearances are lies waiting to be dissolved. The law does not work from the outside in. It works from the inside out. You speak, you believe. You hold the picture, and then the outer world rearranges to match the inner decree. If you doubt because nothing has yet changed, you are like a farmer who digs up his seed each morning to see if it is sprouting. No, plant it, water it, give thanks for it, and the harvest will appear in its season. So take these words into your mouth. I win now. Say them with authority. Say them with conviction. Say them until you feel the vibration in your bones. Say them when you buy the ticket. Say them when you hold it in your hand. Say them when you lay down at night. Let them become the drum beat of your consciousness. And do not mix them with contradiction. Do not say, I win now, and then mutter, but probably not. Do not say, I win now, and then laugh it off as foolishness. Stand firm, hold the decree. Protect it as you would protect a spark in the wind, until it grows into a flame that cannot be quenched. For these 3 words are not empty syllables. They are the rod and the staff, the key and the lock, the hammer and the chisel. They carve your victory into the unseen, and once carved it must appear. Speak them as truth and truth will answer. Speak them as law and law will obey. Speak them as your decree and decree will become demonstration. I win now. Now that you know the decree, I win now. I must give you the safeguard that makes it not only powerful but perfect, not only swift but safe. For there are those who seize the law and wield it rashly, as a child might strike with fire, not knowing what it may consume. You must understand this. The law will obey whatever you impress upon it. And if you impress selfishness, if you impress greed, if you impress a demand that is not aligned with your divine portion, you may receive what you asked for, but with sorrow added, with trouble following, with regret that sour the gift. That is why I teach every student to close their affirmation with the words under grace in perfect ways. Grace is the great adjuster. Grace is the invisible hand that turns aside what would wound you. That shields you from what is not truly yours. That redirects your decree into channels that bless you and all concerned. Grace is love lifted into law. When you say under grace in perfect ways, you are saying let this good come only if it is mine by divine right. Only if it leaves no one harmed. Only if it blesses me without sorrow. And the beauty of grace is this. It does not limit your good. It perfects it. It ensures that what you receive is not only abundance, but right abundance. Not only victory but right victory. Not only gain but gain that leaves your conscience clear, and your spirit at peace. I recall a woman who once demanded that a certain man should marry her. She set her heart upon him, and cried out for him daily. But I would not affirm it, for I knew it might not be her divine selection. Instead, I taught her to say, Infinite Spirit, open the way for my right man to come to me under grace in perfect ways. At first she resisted, but at last she yielded, and soon a man far better suited, kind, generous, faithful came into her life, and she was unspeakably grateful that she had not chained herself to the wrong one. Had she forced her decree without grace, she might have gotten what she thought she wanted, but it would have brought bitterness. With grace, she received what was hers by divine right and joy followed. So it is with money, so it is with tickets, so it is with every desire. You may cry, I win now, and the law will hasten to fulfill. But unless you add under grace in perfect ways, you may draw to yourself winnings that curse you or channels that harm you, or outcomes that entangle you in sorrow. But with grace, the law is clothed in love, and nothing can come that is not rightfully yours. Nothing can enter that is not safe. Nothing can be given that does not bless. Remember the scripture says, "The blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it." That is grace. The riches that come under grace are clean, are pure, are joyful. They do not demand the price of your peace. They do not rob your health. They do not break your relationships. They come in perfect ways and they lift you higher. Therefore, never forget to add these words. They are your safeguard, your shield, your firewall. They keep your demonstration unmarred, your harvest unsored, your victory untainted. So when you stand with ticket in hand, say it all. I win now under grace in perfect ways. Say it boldly. Say it with faith. Say it knowing that grace goes before you, prepares the channel, perfects the method, shields the outcome, and delivers your good in a form more wonderful than your own reasoning could ever have arranged. And then rest. For what comes under grace must bless you, and what comes in perfect ways cannot harm you. There was once a woman who came to me weary, her eyes clouded with disappointment, her voice heavy with the weight of repeated failures. She said, "Miss Shinn, I have spoken affirmations. I have prayed. I have tried to hold faith, but still my purse remains thin, and my luck never turns." And I said to her, "My dear, do not speak of luck, for luck is a lie. Speak of law, for law is truth. And do not weary yourself with many words. One decree spoken with faith carries more power than 1,000 mutterings spoken with doubt. Tonight when you hold your ticket, say simply and with authority, I win now under grace in perfect ways. Say it as truth, not as hope. Say it as law, not as wish. Say it as though God Himself had placed the words on your tongue, for indeed He has. At first she looked at me uncertainly, for the habit of defeat had written deep grooves in her mind. She said, "But Miss Shinn, I have said such things before, and nothing has happened." I answered, "Then you have said them as one testing, as one hoping, as one begging. But the law does not answer hope, it answers faith. It does not obey begging. It obeys command. Do not speak the decree as though you are trying to convince yourself. Speak it as though it is already done. Speak it as though you are the authority, and the world must obey. For it is written, decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee." She went away with those words echoing in her mind. That evening she bought her ticket. She felt the old fear rise, the old doubt whisper, "Why bother? You never win." But instead of bowing to it, she cast it out with the sentence I had given her. She said aloud, "I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free." Then she took her ticket in hand, and declared firmly, clearly, without wavering, "I win now under grace in perfect ways," and with that, she let the matter rest. She did not pace the floor. She did not wring her hands. She did not rehearse failure. She simply trusted the law to do its perfect work. The next day, she returned to me, her face shining with astonishment and joy. She said, "Miss Shinn, you will not believe it. I received unexpected money today. Not through the ticket, but through another channel I never even imagined. A friend I had not heard from in years appeared suddenly, and pressed into my hand a sum of money I desperately needed. And though the ticket itself did not win, I feel I have won greater than I hoped. For I see now that it was never the ticket itself that was my source, but the law of supply that worked through the channel prepared." And I said to her, "You have learned a mighty truth. The ticket is but one channel, and channels come and go, but the source is unchanging. When you decree, I win, now you are not binding yourself to one number, one card, one piece of paper. You are declaring yourself aligned with winning itself. And winning will find you through the channel most perfect, most gracious, most safe. Sometimes it will be the ticket. Sometimes it will be the gift. Sometimes it will be an opportunity. Sometimes it will be a debt paid, a door opened, a channel revealed. But always when spoken with faith, the decree must be fulfilled. So you see, my friend, it is not the lottery that you are commanding. It is the law of abundance itself. It is not the numbers that obey. It is the unseen order of spirit, And when you stand in faith and declare, I win now under grace in perfect ways, the law takes your word and rushes to fulfill it through the nearest open channel. The world will call it chance. The crowd will call it luck, but you will know it is law, and you will rejoice that the invisible has become visible once more. There was another woman, timid and uncertain, who came to me with nothing in her hand, but a little purse and 2,000 tucked inside. Her face betrayed the thought that had haunted her for years. This is not enough. It never will be enough. I am always at the end, always behind, always lacking. And I said to her, do you not know that your purse is not your source? Do you not know that these $2 are not your supply? Do you not know that the Spirit of God is an unfailing treasury, and that your purse is but the channel it flows through? If you curse the channel, you block the stream. If you bless the channel, you open the floodgates. So do not call your purse empty. Do not call your purse poor. Call it the purse of spirit. The magic purse that can never be depleted, that is crammed and jammed and bulging with abundance. I placed my hand upon her purse and spoke aloud. This purse is the purse of spirit. It is crammed and jammed with money. It bulges with bills, with checks, with gold and silver. Money goes out and money comes in perfect circulation, under grace in perfect ways. She looked at me with half a smile, uncertain whether to laugh or to believe. But as I spoke, her imagination caught fire, and I saw her eyes brighten with a new light. She began to picture it herself, the little purse heavy in her hand, bursting with abundance. And I told her, carry that picture with you. Do not see emptiness, see fullness. Do not speak lack, speak plenty. Wave your wand and your purse must obey. Days later she returned to me trembling with joy. She said, Miss Shinn, you will hardly believe it. I have received $6 lozen, a gift unexpected, and it has come so swiftly I can scarcely comprehend it. I answered, do not say you can scarcely comprehend it. Say you comprehend it perfectly, for it is law, not chance. It is the exact harvest of the seed you planted when you blessed your purse and declared it full. And so she learned that her tour had not been a curse, but a seed, and by blessing it, she had multiplied it into thousands. This is why I tell every student, never mock the small, never curse the little, never sigh over the few coins in your hand. For the law does not despise the small. The law multiplies whatever is blessed. Jesus himself did not scorn the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He lifted them, he blessed them, he gave thanks, and the multitude was fed, and baskets overflowed with fragments. Bless the little and it becomes much. Curse the little and it becomes less. Your purse is not a prison, it is a channel. Speak to it as though it were alive. For it is alive with the life of spirit, and it will answer to your word. So I give you now the same decree. This purse of mine is the purse of spirit. It can never be depleted. It is crammed and jammed and bulging with money. Money goes out, and money rushes back in under grace in perfect ways. Say it each time you reach into your purse. Say it each time you spend, each time you receive. Make it a song upon your lips. And you will see soon enough that what once looked like emptiness will swell into fullness, and what once mocked you as poverty will obey you as abundance. For the purse is but a symbol, and the true power is in your word, and your word is your wand. There was once a young woman, scarcely more than a girl, who had read my writings and dared to believe them. She had little money, little backing, little experience, yet in her heart she carried a vision of opening a tea room and candy shop. To those around her, the idea seemed foolish. For the times were hard and her purse was thin, and her family warned her that she was stepping into certain failure. But she had caught a glimpse of truth, and she knew that supply does not come from conditions. It comes from law, and law responds to the spoken word. So she opened her lips each morning and declared, I have a magical work in a magical way. I give magical service for magical pay. She spoke it not once, not twice but daily, faithfully. with the ring of conviction in her voice, and she moved forward in obedience to the vision planted in her spirit. She found a little shop, plain and unremarkable, but she filled it with her word, and the word filled it with customers. On the first day, people came, not in a trickle, but in a stream. They lined up at the door, waiting for tables, waiting for candy, waiting for service, as though they had been summoned by invisible cords. She and her helpers could scarcely keep pace, and each morning, when her assistants grew weary and said, "Surely today will be quieter, surely business will slow," she answered firmly, "No, God is my supply, not man, and every day is a good day." And her decree held true. The shop was crammed and jammed, as she put it, overflowing with customers, filled with orders, alive with abundance. I recall a particular holiday when her workers grew especially discouraged. They said, "Today is a holiday. No one will come. Business will surely be poor." But she replied, "The law does not take holidays. God is my supply, not appearances, and every day is a good day." That very afternoon, an old friend entered the shop, ordered a small box of candy, and when he handed her his check, she opened it, and found it was written for 100. 100 for a 2 lb box of candy. That is how the law works when spoken in faith. The world would call it luck, but she and I knew it was law, the exact outworking of her daily decree. This young woman's tea room became a living example of demonstration. Proof that it is not capital, not conditions, not cleverness that determines success, but the words spoken in fearless faith. She did not lean on advertisements or location, or the opinion of her relatives. She leaned on the law of her own decree, and because she spoke daily with conviction, the invisible moved, the channels opened, and her shop overflowed. So what is the lesson here? That your good is not dependent on what the world says is possible. That appearances of limitation are lies waiting to be dissolved. That when you dare to declare, "Every day is a good day. I have a magical work in a magical way. I give magical service for magical pay." The law of supply must hasten to fulfill your words. Speak this daily over your own work, your own affairs, your own ventures, and watch how what once seemed small and uncertain begins to overflow. Do not bow to appearances. Do not fear the seasons. Do not tremble at holidays or downturns, or the murmurs of those who doubt. Say with faith, "God is my supply, and every day is a good day." And you will see doors open, orders multiply, customers arrive, and channels of increase appear. For the law is exact, and the law never fails the one who never fails to speak the word. When I say to you that every word is a seed, I do not mean that all seeds are alike. For some are small and wither quickly, and some are mighty and take root so deeply that the harvest cannot be denied. The difference lies in the power of the word spoken, and the power lies in its vividness. The subconscious mind is like a child easily impressed by pictures to colors, shapes and living forms, yet deaf to pale abstractions. You may whisper, "I am prosperous," in a faint monotone, and nothing will stir, for the picture is too thin to take hold. But if you say with fire, "My purse is crammed and jammed and bulging with money, overflowing with bills, checks, and gold, alive with endless supply," then the imagination is captured, the subconscious is struck, and the law must move. The words paint pictures, and the pictures become flesh. I have known students who struggled with affirmations for months, repeating lifeless words without result. They came to me weary, saying, "Miss Shinn, I speak my prosperity daily, but still I see nothing." And I asked them, "What do you say?" And they answered with vague mutterings, thin declarations without color. I said, "That is why the ground has not yielded. You have planted shadows instead of seed. Now speak with images, speak with life. Speak with words that carry the weight of substance." And when they obeyed, when they began to say, "I see my purse heavy in my hand, I feel it bulging with supply. I know it is always filled and refilled under grace," their conditions shifted swiftly, and money came by channels unexpected. For the vivid word is not resisted. It is accepted. The subconscious cannot help but obey what is pictured with strength. Do you not see how even the scriptures are filled with vividness? The Master did not speak in pale abstractions. He spoke in parables, in images, in pictures that stirred the imagination. He said, "Consider the lies of the field," and at once the listener saw flowers blooming without toil. He said, "A sower went forth to sow," and all who heard saw the seed fall on rocky soil, on thorny ground, on good earth. He knew that truth must be painted in living color for it to take root. And so must your affirmations. They must be more than dry statements. They must be pictures that live. Therefore, when you declare your abundance, do not say timidly, "I have money." Say boldly, "I walk in abundance now. My purse is filled to overflowing. My life is overflowing. I see money rushing in and rushing out in endless circulation, for it cannot be depleted. It is spirit in visible form." Let every word carry a picture. Let every declaration strike the subconscious like a chisel carving in stone. The law will take the image and reproduce it in the outer world with exactness. The difference between the lifeless word and the vivid word is the difference between a seed left on the surface and a seed driven deep into the soil. One is carried away by the wind, the other is buried in the earth, watered and grown into harvest. If your affirmations have not borne fruit, it may be that you have spoken too faintly, too vaguely, too without picture. Begin today to clothe your affirmations in vividness, in images, in life. Say them until you see them. And when you see them within, you will see them without. So remember this. The subconscious is not moved by shadow, but by picture. Not by faint wish, but by living decree. If you would command fortune, then choose words that paint it so clearly you cannot help but feel it. Say, "My purse is crammed, jammed, bulging with money. I feel it in my hand, I thank it in my heart. I know it is mine by divine right." Speak like this, and the harvest will be swift. For vivid words strike deep, and vivid words always grow. There is a truth I must impress upon you now, for the spoken word carries power, too great to be left without guidance. And that truth is this: every decree must be sealed with the words "under grace in perfect ways." For you must remember the law is exact and impartial. It will bring to pass whatever is impressed upon it. Whether it be wise or foolish, whether it be for blessing or for sorrow. The soil of the subconscious does not argue. It only grows the seed it is given. And so it is possible, if you speak without wisdom, to call in what you think is good only to find that it is not your divine portion, and it brings with it burdens instead of blessings. Grace is the safeguard. Grace is the shield. Grace is the hand of spirit that corrects the clumsy command of the human tongue, and ensures that only what belongs to you, by divine right, only what blesses you and all concerned can enter your life. I recall a woman who once insisted she must marry a particular man. Her whole thought was bent upon him. She said to me, "Miss Shinn, I will not rest until I have this man." But I told her, "I cannot affirm for you what may not be yours by divine right. For if he is not your appointed mate, then to bind him to you would be to bind yourself to sorrow. Instead say, 'Infinite Spirit, open the way for my right man to come to me under grace in perfect ways.'" She resisted at first, for her will was fixed. But at last she yielded, and she began to speak the decree I gave her. And not long afterward, a man of greater kindness, greater faithfulness, greater love came into her life, and she was unspeakably grateful that she had not chained herself to the wrong one. Grace had protected her. Grace had corrected her. Grace had perfected her demonstration. So it is with money, with tickets, with all supply. You may cry out, "I win now." And indeed the law will hasten to fulfill your decree. But if you do not add the safeguard, you may draw to yourself winnings that come through wrong channels, through harm, through methods that disturb your peace. There are those who have gained money only to lose health, or gained wealth only to find misery in its company. but when you add under grace in perfect ways, you ensure that your gain comes clean, comes whole, comes unmarred, leaving no sorrow with it. For is it not written, the blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it? That is the blessing under grace. Understand this clearly. Grace does not limit your good, it perfects it. It does not take away your demonstration, it refineses it. It does not deny your abundance, it multiplies it safely. Grace is the adjustment of spirit, smoothing out the rough edges, closing the wrong doors, opening the right ones, weaving every decree into the divine design, so that nothing harmful can enter, nothing false can stand, nothing premature can ruin. When you say under grace in perfect ways, you place your word into the hands of infinite intelligence, and you can rest knowing that what comes is exactly right, exactly safe, exactly perfect. So take this safeguard to your lips every time you speak your decree. Do not say merely, I win now. Say, I win now under grace in perfect ways. Do not say merely, large sums of money come to me. Say, large sums of money come to me quickly under grace in perfect ways. Do not say merely, my purse is filled. Say, my purse is filled and refilled under grace in perfect ways. Make these words the seal upon every decree, and you will never fear that your demonstration may bring regret. Grace will go before you. Grace will guard you. Grace will perfect what you have spoken. And so I tell you, never speak a word of power without clothing it in grace. For grace is the robe that makes your decree fit to walk in the courts of heaven. Grace is the crown that makes your affirmation shine with divine authority. Grace is the safeguard that ensures that your harvest will be good, and only good. Seal your words with grace, and you will find that every demonstration not only blesses you but blesses all who touch it, and you will walk in the peace of knowing that your supply is perfect, safe, and sure. Now I come to a law that many pass by lightly, thinking it but sentiment, thinking it but good manners, and so they rob themselves of its multiplying power. That law is the law of gratitude and praise. Gratitude is not courtesy alone, it is creative force. Praise is not flattery, it is spiritual chemistry. When you bless and give thanks for what you have, no matter how small, you put the seal of multiplication upon it. When you murmur and complain about what you have, no matter how much you place the seal of decrease upon it, and the law is exact. Whatever you bless increases. Whatever you curse diminishes. Whatever you thank God for multiplies in your life. Do you not remember the story of Jesus and the loaves and fishes? There were 5 loaves and 2 small fish, far too little for the multitude that gathered. The disciples looked at the lack and despaired, but Jesus lifted the little, gave thanks, blessed it, and handed it back. And as it was passed among the people, it multiplied until thousands were fed, and 12 baskets overflowed with fragments. He did not despise the smallness. He did not curse the insufficiency. He gave thanks, and thanksgiving turned the little into much. That was no miracle outside of law. It was law itself demonstrated perfectly. I knew a woman who came to me with only a small sum left, trembling that it could not last her through the week. I told her, do not curse it, do not call it small. Place your hand upon it and say, I thank God for this evidence of supply, and I bless it to multiply under grace in perfect ways. She obeyed, though to her reasoning mind it felt foolish. She blessed the little she had. She gave thanks over it. She treated it as seed, and within days new channels opened. Fresh income appeared, and she was delivered from her fear. The money had multiplied not by arithmetic but by law, not by chance, but by decree sealed with thanksgiving. Why does this work? Because gratitude is the magnet that draws more of what you thank God for. Praise is the atmosphere in which increase flourishes. To complain is to choke the seed. To thank is to water it. To murmur is to poison the soil. To praise is to enrich it. You may think gratitude is a feeling you wait for. But I tell you, gratitude is a decree you choose. Say, I thank thee for my immediate and endless supply. I bless every dollar in my purse and it multiplies. And the very act of thanking will call in more to thank for. The very act of blessing will open channels for more blessing to flow. The world thinks when I have more, then I will give thanks. But the law says give thanks now and you will have more. The world says when the purse is full, then I will bless it. But the law says bless it now and it will be full. Thanksgiving goes first. Multiplication follows after. If you wait to thank until you see, you will wait long. But if you thank before you see, you will see swiftly. For faith gives thanks in advance, and faith always receives. So I charge you, never again call what you have little. Never again sigh over your portion. Never again curse your purse with words of lack. Lay your hand upon it and bless it. Lift it to heaven in praise. Say, I thank thee for this purse, which is the purse of spirit. It is filled and refilled, crammed and jammed and bulging with money. I bless every dollar that passes through my hands, for it returns to me multiplied. I praise thee that my barns are full, and my cup runs over. Say it until your whole soul rings with thanksgiving. Say it until your atmosphere is charged with praise. And you will see soon enough that what once looked like little has become much. And what once seemed not enough has become more than enough. For gratitude and praise are not ornaments to the law. They are the law. They are the force that multiplies every sum, that enlarges every gift, that increases every seed. Bless and you will see increase. Thank you, multiplication. Praise and you will walk in overflow. This is the truth and this is the way, and this is the power that makes every dollar a seed that grows into harvest. Before the decree can be spoken with power, before the 3 words can fall like thunder into the silence, you must understand the chamber into which they will be cast. That chamber is the subconscious mind, the silent partner of every life, the hidden builder of every fortune and every failure. The subconscious is not clever. It is not creative in itself. It is obedient. It does not reason. It does not question. It does not decide between just and earnest. It is the soil that receives and multiplies whatever seed is dropped within it. If you drop fear, it grows fear. If you drop doubt, it grows doubt. If you drop hope mingled with worry, it grows confusion. But if you drop faith, pure and simple, faith clothed in words of power, then the subconscious rushes to work without delay, building bridges, arranging circumstances, opening channels, until the invisible seed has pressed itself into visible form. Now, here is the mystery most people never consider. The subconscious is most open when the conscious watchman is wary. And this happens in the twilight before sleep. All day long you may speak words of faith, and the conscious mind may rise up to argue. It is not possible. It has never happened. It cannot be so. All day long appearances may shout louder than your decree. But at night, when the eyes grow heavy, and the reasoning mind lays down its arms, the gate to the subconscious swings wide, and whatever word is last spoken slips past without resistance. That word is planted in the richest soil, where it will grow all through the hours of slumber, and you will awaken to find its first fruits already forming. This is why I tell my students, never go to bed with fear on your lips. Never lie down with complaint as your lullaby. Never let the last seed you plant be one of lack or doubt. For the harvest will rise to meet you in the morning, and you will wonder why life feels heavy, not knowing it was you who planted heaviness in the dark. Therefore, preparation is essential. Before you speak the decree of winning, before you utter the words that shift the odds, you must clear the field of old weeds. How? By casting every burden on the Christ within. Say it aloud with authority, with calmness, with faith. I cast this burden upon the Christ within and I go free. Whatever the fear, whatever the debt, whatever the worry, hand it over, leave it behind. Refuse to carry it into the night. For if you cling to it, you will plant it and it will grow. But if you release it, the ground will be cleared and the soil will be ready. Once the burden is cast, fill the space with praise. Do not leave your subconscious empty, for empty ground quickly gathers weeds. Say, I thank God for my immediate and endless supply. I thank God that my purse is filled and refilled. I thank God that what is mine by divine right now comes to me under grace in perfect ways. Say it until peace fills you, until your chest loosens, until your heart feels light, until you are resting already in abundance. Then, and only then, is the subconscious prepared to receive the decree. Think of it as the clearing of a temple before the entrance of a king. You sweep the floor, you light the lamps, you open the gates, and you fill the air with song. Only then do you usher in the sovereign. So it is with your subconscious. You cast out fear. You light the lamp of praise. You open the gate with thanksgiving. And then you invite the decree to enter. And once spoken in such an atmosphere, the decree cannot fail. For it is received in purity, planted in readiness, and sealed in peace. So take this to heart. Do not rush past preparation. Do not despise it. Do not think the decree will work if fear still crouches in the corners of your mind. Clear the soil. Cast the burden, fill the chamber with gratitude. And then when the hour is quiet, and the eyes are heavy, speak the words that must bring your demonstration. For the subconscious is a faithful servant, and what you give it in the night, it will give back to you in the day. Now the hour has come. All the preparation, all the clearing of the field, all the casting away of burdens, all the blessing of the little, all the vivid words, all the guarding of the tongue, it has all been leading here. For truth must always rise to its decree, and decree must always be spoken before it can be seen. You have heard me say again and again that the word is the seed, that the word is the wand, that the word is law. And now you will take that wand in hand, and you will speak not as a beggar asking for scraps, not as a gambler hoping for chance, not as one half believing and half doubting, but as one who knows that the infinite has clothed them with authority, as one who knows that heaven bends to the decree of faith, as one who knows that when the word is spoken with certainty, the unseen rearranges itself at once to obey. And the decree is this: I win now. 3 words, no more, yet carrying the whole force of law within them. Why these 3? Because they are clothed in the present tense, and the subconscious knows only now. It does not register tomorrow. It does not act on someday. It does not stir itself for I will. When you say, I will win, you postpone your harvest into a future that never arrives. But when you say, I win now, you anchor it in the eternal present. And the subconscious accepts it as fact. And once accepted, it must bring it forth. That is why I teach you to speak not of what may be, but of what already is. Do not wait for evidence to declare. Declare and evidence will follow. Speak it with fire, with certainty, with authority. Do not whisper it as a faint hope. Do not mutter it as a wish. Do not dress it in timidity. Let it fall from your lips like a hammer striking the anvil, like a trumpet sounding in battle, like a king proclaiming law. Say it aloud. I win now. Say it again until your very bones vibrate with it. Say it until your imagination bursts with the picture of victory. Say it until the subconscious, that faithful servant, bows and says, it is done. And do not be moved by appearances. When you first speak, the ticket may look unchanged. The purse may still feel light. The bank account may still show lack. But appearances are shadows, and shadows cannot stand before the light of truth. Speak the decree and let appearances dissolve in their own time. Do not dig up the seed to see if it is sprouting. Do not cancel your word with mutterings of doubt. Speak and then stand still, knowing that the law is already at work, that the seed is already alive, that the harvest is already pushing through the soil. I knew a student who took this decree upon her lips. For years, she had said, I hope, I wish, maybe someday. And the harvest was always delay and disappointment. But when she learned to say, I win now, Her whole atmosphere shifted. She walked differently. She looked differently. She carried her ticket differently. Not as one clutching at chance, but as one holding proof of law. And though the ticket itself was not the channel, within days unexpected money poured into her life through another door. She came to me astonished, saying, "It worked, but not as I thought." And I said, "It always works, and it always chooses the perfect way." For the decree does not bind itself to one channel. It opens every channel, and the law chooses the best. So take it into your mouth now, you who have listened, you who have longed, you who have waited. Take the decree and plant it in the soil of your soul. I win now. Say it when you wake. Say it when you walk. Say it when you hold the ticket. Say it when you lie down at night. Make it the rhythm of your day and the seal of your night. Protect it from contradiction. Refuse to cancel it with idle talk. Let it echo and echo until it fills your being. And then watch, for the world will shift, the channels will open, the money will flow, and what was once called chance will reveal itself as law. Law obedient to your decree. 3 words spoken with faith, spoken with conviction, spoken with certainty. I win. Now this is the sentence. This is the wand. This is the key. Use it and see how swiftly the invisible bends to obey. Now that you have spoken the decree, I win now, and sealed it with grace, you must take one more step. A step that many stumble over, and by stumbling cancel their good. You must release the channel. For the law is not bound to the narrow path of your reasoning. The infinite mind is not limited to the one door you are watching, nor to the one instrument you have chosen. Yet how often do men and women decree their good, and then bind it with their own conditions? They say, "I win now, but it must be through this ticket, through this number, through this very drawing." And if the channel they have chosen does not open, they cry, "The law has failed me." But the law cannot fail. What has failed is their faith, for they clung to one method, while the infinite was opening 1,000 others. Think of it this way. The farmer sows seed and trusts the earth. He does not dig up the ground each morning demanding to see through which grain of soil the stalk will rise. He leaves the method to the law of growth. The tailor receives your order for a coat. You tell him the style and the size, but you do not dictate the stitch or the thread or the exact path of the needle. You leave the method to the craftsman. So must you leave the channel to infinite intelligence, which knows all ways, sees all paths, holds all means. When you decree, "I win," now you have ordered your coat. You have planted your seed. Your part is complete. The method is God's. This is where faith must show itself, for faith does not cling, faith releases, faith does not dictate, faith trusts, faith does not strain, faith rests. You must say, "I win now under grace in perfect ways, and I leave the channel to infinite mind. I do not bind my demonstration to one number or one door. My supply may come through the ticket, or through another channel more perfect, more safe, more swift. But come it must, for the law has heard my decree, and the law cannot fail." Speak this, believe this, and you will not be shaken when appearances seem to delay. For you will know that the decree is already alive, already growing, already pressing into form through the path of least resistance. I remember a student who spoke for money to pay her debts. She affirmed faithfully. Yet she feared that it could only come through her employer, and she grew anxious when her employer gave no raise. She came to me disheartened, saying, "It has not worked." I told her, "You are binding your good to one channel. Release it. The law has 1,000 instruments. Say instead, God is my unfailing supply. I do not limit the channels. What is mine by divine right now rushes to me under grace in perfect ways." She obeyed, and not long after a gift came to her from a relative she had not heard from in years, more than enough to pay her debts and leave her in freedom. The channel was unexpected, but the decree was fulfilled, for the law cannot fail. Do not make the mistake of dictating the method. Do not strain your eyes at one door, while the law is opening another behind you. Do not cry. It must be through this ticket or else it is nothing. That is not faith. That is fear in disguise. Faith says, I have spoken and it is done. I do not care through what door it comes, for all doors are God's. I do not care through what hand it is given, for all hands are God's. I do not care what path it takes, for all paths lead back to me when I decree. That is the freedom of true faith, and that is the freedom that brings demonstration. So tonight when you speak the decree, release the channel. Say, I win now under grace in perfect ways, and I leave the method to infinite intelligence. Rest in that, trust in that. Know that the code is already being cut. The seed is already sprouting. The law is already fulfilling. And then watch in awe as the good comes. Often through doors you never knocked upon. Often through paths you never traced. Often through ways more ingenious than you could have imagined. For the law is sure, the supply is certain, the word is seed, and the harvest must come. Now we have walked the path together, and you see clearly that life is not ruled by luck, nor governed by chance, nor decided by the blind drawing of numbers. Life is governed by law eternal, exact, unbending yet full of love when sealed with grace. I have shown you why luck fails, why idle words create poverty, why careless jokes plant weeds that grow into thorns. I have shown you that every word is a seed, that the tongue is a wand, that the purse is not a prison, but a channel of spirit waiting to be blessed. I have shown you students who were lifted from despair into plenty, who turned 2,000 to 6,000, who filled a little shop until it overflowed, not by struggle, not by toil, but by decree. I have led you step by step into the inner chamber of the subconscious, where the soil of your soul waits each night, to receive the seed that you choose. I have taught you to clear it with release, to sweep it with the broom of burden casting, to water it with praise, to guard it with thanksgiving, and then at the climactic hour, I placed in your hand the decree. 3 words of power, 3 words of present tense law, 3 words that collapse chance into certainty. I win now. This is not a toy, not a trick, not a charm for gamblers. This is law. It is as serious as the sunrise, as exact as the seasons, as faithful as the tide. Speak these words with faith, and the subconscious must accept them. And once accepted, the law must bring them to pass. Seal them always with under grace in perfect ways, so that nothing harmful, nothing false, nothing premature can touch you, and once spoken, release the channel. Let the infinite choose the door. Let the law arrange the method. Let grace perfect the way. Do not clutch, do not dictate, do not bind. Say it, believe it, release it, and rest. And let me remind you, gratitude and praise are not afterthoughts. They are multipliers. Bless every dollar, thank every coin, praise every channel, and you will see increase upon increase. Do not curse the little. Do not despise the day of small things. Do not sigh over what you think is not enough. Bless it, thank it, praise it, and it will multiply. For the blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it. That is grace, and that is law perfected. So here is my final charge to you. For the next 7 nights before you sleep, cast your burden on the Christ within. Clear the ground of fear. Sweep the chamber of worry. Then with calm authority, speak the decree. I win now under grace in perfect ways. Let those be the last words upon your lips as you pass into slumber. Plant them deeply and rise each morning, giving thanks that it is already done. Watch, for in those days channels will open, opportunities will appear, supply will flow, and what once seemed bound to chance will reveal itself as law. Law that never fails. Say it with me now aloud, as a seal upon all we have learned. God is my unfailing supply. I win now under grace in perfect ways. I bless every dollar and it multiplies. I thank God for my immediate and endless abundance. Say it until you feel the vibration rise within you. Until the words no longer sound like hope, but like certainty. Until the truth burns in your bones like fire shut up in your heart. That is when you will know that the decree is alive, and the harvest cannot be delayed. And if you desire to go further, if you long not only to win but to multiply, not only to receive but to expand, then go with me into the next teaching. This one sentence multiplies every dollar you touch. There I will give you the decree of increase, the law of expansion, the secret by which every sum in your hand grows larger, every coin returns multiplied, every channel overflows. Click it now and continue the journey. For the law is endless, the supply is infinite, and the word is your wand.